When we look at this pandemic, it's been driven by testing. In many ways, it's been referred to as a testdemic. Anytime you raise the amount of testing you do, you also raise the amount of infections you're going to find. That's just an obvious mathematical scenario. Behind this pandemic is the PCR test we've all heard about, and that was designed by a scientist named Kary Mullis. He actually won the Nobel Prize for designing PCR testing.
You're familiar with the testing. That's the nasal swab. They take this big 4 to 6 inch swab, they jam it down your nose. What seems like, takes an hour to do the swabbing. They pull out some samples of your DNA. They put it on a little dish. We send it to the lab. The lab then takes that, and what they do is they look at this under a really specific type of a device, this machine, and they amplify your DNA. They actually take your own DNA and they magnify it. They blow it up, 2 times, 4 times, 6 times, again and again and again. And every time they magnify it and amplify the cycle, you can see more and more stuff that's going on in your own DNA and in that tissue sample. Well, we know that if you blow it up big enough, at least according to PhD Nobel Prize winning scientist Kary Mullis, who's the doctor that created the PCR test, if you blow that PCR sample size up big enough, you can see almost anything on any body.
And with PCR, if you do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody. It starts making you believe in the sort of Buddhist notion that everything is contained in everything else, right? I mean, because if you can amplify one single molecule up to something that you can really measure, which PCR can do, then there's just very few molecules that you don't have at least one single one of them in your body, okay? So that could be thought of as a misuse of it, just to claim that it's meaningful.
And one of the things that we forget is that 45% of our human DNA, which is called our microbiome, is made up of viruses that live inactive and dormant in our body. That's part of our immune system. And so if you've ever been exposed to a coronavirus in the past, whether it's a cold, a flu, a respiratory infection, that can show up on a PCR test if you blow it up above a certain amplification. I don't know if you remember last summer where there were laboratory tests that were done in labs in Florida and in Georgia, and they were showing 100%, literally 100% of their tests were coming through were positive for the SARS-CoV-2 test.
There are dozens of labs that process tests. On the state's website, we found numerous labs that are only reporting positive test results. So they show a 100% positivity rate.
That means every single person tested was positive. We sifted through the reports to find local testing sites with high numbers. Like this Centricare, 83 people tested and all positive. Check out the Orlando VA, a positivity rate of 76%. NCF Diagnostics has a location in Alachua, 88% of tests coming back positive, and 98% for Orlando Health. Of course, it makes you wonder if these numbers are wrong, are other numbers on the report also wrong?
The only reason why that was is because they were testing at 40 amplification and above. And if you look at the big laboratories in the United States and across the globe, and I know because I've spoken to almost all of them, the PCR testing is done at 37 to 45 amplifications, which is going to cause a 97% false positive or more. That's why you're seeing all these people that have positive tests, but yet have no symptomatology. And remember, you can be diagnosed with SARS-CoV-2, but not develop COVID-19, which is the disease caused by SARS-CoV-2, because if you're asymptomatic, you don't have the disease by definition of the CDC.
Now, in his own words, the PCR test should never be used to diagnose disease. Let me repeat that. The man who created the PCR test said this test should never be used to diagnose disease. It is simply a tool to find if there's even a fragment of an illness inside of somebody. It came about when they were looking for AIDS and very difficult to find viruses that you wouldn't, as he said, you can't always, he made fun of Tony Fauci. Kary Mullis did not like Tony Fauci, thought he was completely uneducated for the job, wasn't a scientist, was basically just a pencil pusher, a bureaucrat that controlled scientists. And Kary Mullis had a serious problem with Tony Fauci.
Guys like Fauci get up there and start talking, he doesn't know anything really about anything. And I'd say that to his face. Nothing. The man thinks you can take a blood sample and stick it in an electron microscope, and if it's got a virus in there, you'll know it. He doesn't understand electron microscopy, and he doesn't understand medicine, and he should not be in a position like he's in. Most of those guys up there on the top are just total administrative people, and they don't know anything about what's going on at the bottom. You know, those guys have got an agenda, which is not what we would like them to have, being that we pay for them to take care of our health in some way. They've got a personal kind of agenda. They make up their own rules as they go. They change them when they want to, and they smugly, like Tony Fauci, does not mind going on television in front of the people that pay his salary and lie directly into the camera. You can't expect the sheep to really respect the best and the brightest. They don't know the difference, really. I mean, I like humans, don't get me wrong, but basically the vast majority of them do not possess the ability to judge who is and who isn't a really good scientist. I mean, that's a problem. That's a main problem, actually, with science, I'd say, in this century, because science is being judged by people, and funding is being done by people who don't understand it. Okay, who do we trust? Fauci? Fauci doesn't know enough to, you know. If Fauci wants to get on television with somebody who knows a little bit about this stuff and debate him, he could easily do it, because he's been asked.
And the beauty of a PCR is you can find something that is almost, it's so small it's non-existent, or in some cases really might be non-existent. And so what we know when we investigated this is that the PCR test tends to be about 100% accurate for about 7 to 10 cycles. If you find a virus within 7 to 10 cycles, then there's a good chance that you currently have fragments of, in this case, coronavirus or SARS-CoV-2 inside of you. But after that 7 to 10 cycles, it starts to quickly decline in its accuracy. And so by the time you're at 25 cycles, you've dropped down to, I think around 75% accurate. Even Anthony Fauci said himself that anything you find beyond 33 cycles in a PCR test, meaning you've amplified it 33 times, probably is not infectious material and wouldn't lead to an infection in anybody else, right?
What is now sort of evolving into a bit of a standard that if you get a cycle threshold of 35 or more, that the chances of it being replication competent are minuscule. So that if somebody, and we have patients, and it's very frustrating for the patients as well as for the physicians. Somebody comes in and they repeat their PCR and it's like 37 cycle threshold. But you almost never can culture virus from a 37 threshold cycle. So I think if somebody does come in with 37, 38, even 36, you got to say, it's just dead nucleotides, period.
The New York Times reported that the CDC's own calculations suggest that it is extremely difficult to detect any live viruses in a sample above a threshold of 33 cycles. Anthony Fauci even admits that high cycle thresholds produce false positive results from dead nucleotides. And the truth is that we all have viral debris in our bodies. The more you magnify the sample, the greater the chance of detecting viral fragments that are not infectious outside of the spike protein. Without the spike protein that binds to the ACE2 receptor, the virus has no opportunity to enter the cell and replicate.
So he's basically saying after 33 cycles, this test is useless for determining the existence of SARS-CoV-2. Yet when we looked in the United States of America at everybody using all of the testing facilities, and New York Times did this too, all the testing facilities that were doing PCR tests, they were running them for 45 cycles. Meaning they were picking up, such minuscule fragments that in Tony Fauci's own words, they couldn't have been infectious and they weren't the disease. And so how many people, we are talking about at 45 cycles, you can have a misdiagnosis rate as high as 98% false positives.
In fact, the New York Times even put out a story, and I'm going to quote a little bit of what they said. There's glitches in the PCR test. 90% of the tests were not indicative of the active illness.
I believe it was 2006 or 7 at Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center. It was thought that there was an outbreak of whooping cough, and the staff there used the PCR technology, because again, I don't want to refer to it as a test, to diagnose whooping cough, and it had a 0% efficacy rate, and that I did not misspeak. It was actually 0%. And believe it or not, the New York Times covered that story and didn't take it down. Last I checked, it was still there. So the one time it was used in some medical setting, it had a 0% efficacy rate.
Prior to COVID-19, when we would use PCR testing, we still use PCR testing for other things, and it's useful sometimes, but it's useful when you've actually isolated a particular the genetic material of a particular organism. Then you could take that material and you know what you're looking for. Whereas in the case of COVID-19, since it hasn't been proven, at least to my satisfaction, that we even have that genetic material, what are they actually amplifying? Nobody really knows what they're actually amplifying, but they amplify it exponentially, and then the more they amplify it, the more likely the genetic material that you're looking for, which Carrie Mullis called, a needle in a haystack, you're more likely to get what you're looking for if you amplify it more times.
And so to have relied on these PCR tests to drive the pandemic, and also to drive this concept of asymptomatic carriers, this is something I want everyone to reflect back. When did you ever hear about an asymptomatic carrier? And really, the question is what is an asymptomatic carrier? Is it somebody that is a false positive, which it very well could be, using a test that is running way too many cycles to be accurate? Or is it just a healthy person whose body so absolutely kicked this virus's butt that they never had any symptoms? Even so, the body already killed that virus. And maybe there's some floating fragments that a test could pick up, but are they infectious? Either way, there's still questions on whether or not an asymptomatic carrier even exists. And beyond that, does an asymptomatic carrier spread the disease at all? And almost every study around the world has said that we don't see any evidence of spread from asymptomatic carriers. Now, that may not seem like a big deal to your average person, but if asymptomatic carriers do not spread this illness, or if they happen to be just a false positive from a bad study, either way, if they're not spreading, then we never should have locked down the world. Then masks are totally irrelevant. We can go back to the way we've practiced medicine since polio and smallpox, which is we quarantine sick people, not healthy people. That's what the PCR test did. The PCR test set up this false positive that had us start quarantining healthy people for the first time in world history.